Welcome to City Talks, where we discuss the big issues facing UK cities and the latest thinking on urban policy with expert guests. I'm your host, Andrew Carter from the think tank Centre for Cities. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to this episode of City Talks. Today I'm joined by my colleagues Anthony Breach and Maurice Lange, and we're going to be talking about housing, and in particular we're going to be unpicking the statements and comments that the new Prime Minister has made, Andy Burnham, about housing, and in particular his emphasis on council house building, why he's emphasised that, what that might mean more broadly. So we're going to try and figure out what he means by council house building. How does it fit into the broader urban housing crisis, which we've definitely written about and talked about for a very long time? And if we are to see a meaningful change, both in house building more generally and council house building within that, what additional reforms are going to be needed around for the planning system? How do we think about density and all of that? So we're going to explore these different elements. Maurice, you kick us off, take a step back. As I say, in his opening speech, which was a couple of weeks ago now, talked about housing in general, but also about council housing. Just paint a bigger picture about the nature and shape of the urban housing crisis. Why was it in that speech? What do we know about it? What have we written about it?
So I think Andy Burnham is absolutely right. In his speech, he described the UK as being in a housing trap, as housing supply being the source of a lot of problems. And I think we'd definitely say there's something not working very well with how we build houses in cities. That's due to the planning system constraining the way that the urban form evolves, such that we've ended up with cities with far fewer homes in them and close to the city centre than in comparable countries. And that's also on council housing and affordable housing. You know, we've got incredibly long temporary accommodation waiting lists. A temporary accommodation crisis paired with very long council housing waiting lists is clearly an issue, with people on lower wages being able to access jobs in cities or live in them at all.
Yeah, and obviously we've written and talked about housing and the housing crisis for quite a long time, with some big number. I mean, Maurice has given us sort of the sense of some of the issues, but we've also attached quite large numbers to those sort of problems, which is decades in the making, not just more recent.
Yes, that's exactly right, Andrew. So we did some research a few years ago looking at how many houses have we underbuilt relative to other European countries since the introduction of the planning system in 1947. Found that relative to the average Western European country, we're missing about 4.3 million homes. It's about kind of 13-14% of the country's housing stock. And if you look then within cities in particular, we've done some more recent research led by Maurice, suggesting we found over 2 million houses are missing from our cities being lower density than their peers in France and Japan. So I think I think it's important to stress that this housing shortage, this absence of building in the country, it's bad. It's causing a bunch of social problems, but it's also causing a large number of economic problems as well. Some of those are quite short term in terms of low construction, right? We're missing construction jobs as a result of this. We're having low investment rates as a result of this. But also, I think this is where we have particular interest is it has impacts on agglomeration effects and on urbanization as well.
Yeah, and Maurice, I would say he kind of talked about and emphasised council building particularly. We'll come on to the ownership and the control aspect of that agenda for a minute. We've all seen and all used, and we've produced our own versions of house building over the longer term and the relevant contribution that the private and public and non-public, non-private have made to that. So again, just paint us a picture, because he talks about going back to the to days of past. Just give us a sense of how the non-private contribution has evolved and changed over time.
Yeah, so the non-private contribution, which in this context, I guess you take as subsidized, not market rent housing.
Yeah, it's not an easy way to describe it. Use an actual term. Maybe non-private is not the best way, but
we called it public.
Yeah,
because understanding that it is a non-market good. So in the post-war period, the first 10 years after the Second World War, it was building 80% of all housing. The 25 years after that, There's a mixed public-private model, but the public sector is still building over 100,000 homes a year every year. And then you see a really distinct change in that through the 80s, after a combination of the introduction of the right to buy and the reduction in grants for public house building. It doesn't disappear completely, and there's a transition from it being provided by councils to housing associations, but we've definitely not been hitting those post-war 100,000 plus numbers since the 80s. It's
Yeah.
been more around 20, 30, 50,000 at tops.
And that's quite important because, as you say, the terms, or on the one hand, they're never exact, but in the sense we've had council housing that was once literally owned and run by councils, but we've also quite a big program of transferring that stock into housing associations or registers, sort of landlord times. So it kind of sits in a sort of quasi council stroke affordable social housing space, but it's not classically and traditionally thought of as council housing.
Yes, so it all gets more complicated the more you understand about it.
Stay with us, Ashley. Stay with us.
But yeah, I suppose you've got a wave of transfers to housing associations, and you've got housing associations taking over the majority of new building, because after the introduction of the right to buy, which wasn't applied to housing associations, and the fact that receipts from right to buy, even at discount, went to central government rather than local authorities. Local authorities from the 1980s onwards were in an incredibly undermined position. They would have lost money with any council house building that they did. So responsibility for new building almost wholesale transfers to housing associations. But then in different parts of the country, you've seen different approaches to who owns the remainder of the stock. Most cities, but not all of the ones that we look at as centre cities, have retained at least a large chunk of their social housing stock under local authority management. But housing associations take on a significant share in all places, and in some councils, or in half of councils across the country, housing associations are the only social housing providers. We can talk also about the changing tenure mix, because what Andy Burnham, I think, means when he says council housing is he means social housing. And the last version, or the most recent version of the Labour government, they did sort of change the emphasis in terms of the tenure mix towards social housing. And so I guess Burnham's emphasis on council housing is an extension of the preference for social rent. But then there is a question about whether or not he really means local authority building, which would be a really big change in terms of
that would be
the model.
Big change. And it does seem to be as if there's something in that, not least because, yes, he talked about housing in the way that we've just described it, but he's also thinking about housing as one of the sort of foundational pillars of good, of a good life and of good growth. And there he emphasizes issues around control and ownership in the same ways he might do that for water, or he might do that for electricity, or indeed he has done that for transport. And so there's not just a development kind of question, there's a control ownership question, which I think is interesting. We'll see we don't know how this is going to play out. As you said, if we are really going to get lots of councils building more homes, that's going to be quite a significant change across a number of different levers. But it's just interesting. There's a sort of philosophical element to his thinking as well as a practical element.
Yeah, the accountability argument's an interesting one, right? Because it's not one you often hear in the devolution space, where a lot of it's about the economics. A lot of it is about sort of democratic accountability, dealing with anxieties or frustrations that the public has. I think to try and join up a few of these different things together by saying part of the frustrations that the public has with our current government settlements is that too many decisions are taken not just by Whitehall and by decision makers in London, but even those institutions that aren't on Whitehall but are perhaps in Quangos, perhaps in housing associations, perhaps in the water companies. There's actually very limited ability for people in different parts of the country to shape the outcomes that they experience every single day, and are reduced essentially to almost harassing like customers on the end of a phone line. So I think it's an interesting argument for sure. I think there's then a bunch of implications that then follow from that, in terms of not just your funding, but in terms of how much discretion are we going to allow places and locally elected leaders to deviate from each other, and indeed set different standards and choices for themselves. that differ from what we are, deciding nationally.
Yeah.
I guess there's two things I'd say in addition to that. Firstly is on the kind of accountability thing, at a kind of minor league in terms of scale of importance, but still quite important. We have seen, especially in London, the movement in recent years from arm's length bodies, which are not housing associations, but they're council affiliated management organizations. Those that through the 2000s, as recent as the New Labour, they were pushing councils to set up these organizations, which would be outside of political accountability. Basically, the idea that politics is chaos, and so if we just give it to some bureaucrats, it'll be all run itself okay. In a very short amount of time, that has not proved itself to be all that good, and we've seen the return of those to council control. So lots of London local authorities I know have brought back in-house those arm's length bodies in the last few years, and that has to some extent then put them in a position where they can start to build more themselves already. And I guess as well as the kind of accountability political point for why you would think about councils being the more sensible authority to be managing social housing stock, it's that they also have the legal responsibility for meeting homelessness, preventing homelessness, particularly of families. So the people that get added to the waiting lists are added to council's responsibility, and then councils at the moment have to go, okay, housing association A, B, and C, you are building this. Can I put people off my list onto your houses? If that was the council managing all of that, that would presumably be more streamlined. And then also councils are in charge of planning permissions, and so if you had a housing association which was coming up against difficulties in planning, that's because they're two different entities, and you would hope that a council would not be chopping its own feet off through the planning system. Although you
can never guarantee against that, but
you can't guarantee it.
Guarantees it by far.
Think of examples where that is happening.
Yeah. Okay, so it's going to move on to a little bit around the scope of it. So, Maurice, you looked at this. I mean, since it's important to say that the Starmer government made quite a significant increase to the affordable homes program, when they came in, announcement, quite a substantive increasing grant available to do these sorts of things. So just unpack that a little bit. And then related to that, I guess, is that, just understanding within that, which is where it gets slippery, what that affordable homes actually means, because that also ultimately determines the type of thing that you want, determines how much of it you can get given a set amount of cash.
Yeah.
So just unpack a little bit of that. I think that, Starmer government under Rayner, when she was in CLG, made quite a substantive commitment to boosting the affordable homes program, of which there were different tenures, but all in that social housing mix. Of that.
Yeah, yes, definitely. So setting aside the question of who for now, thinking about the main determinant of how much social housing or other non-market housing you get is basically the types of non-market housing you ask for, i.e. the degree of subsidy required. If it is 50% of market rent, that requires more subsidy for any given home that you build. If it's only 80%, you can maybe build 2.5 times as much with the same amount of grant.
Yeah.
So it's the mix of those two things, and then how much money you're going to put in. On the size of the commitment, yes, in the spending review about this time last year, there was the £39 billion commitment over 10 years. It sounds like a very big number. It is roughly equivalent to twice what was given in the preceding decade, but it is slightly backloaded. So it's a kind of ramp up rather than an even spend of £3.9 billion a year. From some perspectives, that makes sense, given that the sector needs to adjust to a change in their circumstances. But recently we've seen both the GLA and Homes England, who administer that grant, say to housing associations and councils, you're overbidding, you're being too ambitious, we don't have the grant to give out that you're asking for, suggesting that there is capacity in the sector to absorb more grant. But that is nevertheless a significantly bigger chunk of money than had been given previously. It does compare not all that favorably to the sums of money that were being given in the post-war period.
No, of course.
You would be spending between 10 and 15 billion pounds a year in today's money through the post-war period on subsidy for social housing, whereas the equivalent 3 to 4 billion is obviously significantly smaller, which results in significantly fewer homes. And then the question on the mix of social versus other tenures. This government is making the recent Labour government before Burnham is making slightly less of each of the grant in terms of numerical gains, because they're preferring social housing. So in the at the moment, it's a 60-40 split is what councils are being asked to, or what Homes England and the GLA are being asked to deliver. And that's what's coming through in the new London plan draft out today. They're expecting 60% social housing and 40% intermediate tenures.
Yeah.
If Burnham were to say, I'm not changing my grant, but I'm going to go 50-50, he could reasonably claim I'm going to build more homes, but those homes would be for different people.
Yeah. Because what we don't know, and we assume at least that council housing, if it's built by councils, will be subsidized in some shape or form. It's not like I don't think he envisages councils becoming active in the housing market across all tenures and at all price points. I mean, that may happen. We don't know, but I don't imagine that is the case at the minute. This is a particular subset that he's particularly interested in, which is the sort of subsidized element to it.
I think it's a bit unclear as to what he thinks at the moment. I think all of the potential things are in play. I don't think, like, some councils have a lot of public land which they dispose of through a mixed public and private schemes, and in so doing basically serve as a builder of all tenures, and they manage that private land in different ways.
Yeah.
You can imagine a situation where local authorities, using compulsory purchase or just purchasing land, perform more of a role in development. And definitely some of Burnham's advisors have spoken positively about the idea that they might do that.
Yeah.
The idea of a state house builder is floated around in recent months, and that is, as I understand it, what it would be doing as a purchaser of land and procurer of development. But yeah, I think what Burnham is saying when he says council house building is probably a social rent.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think one of the biggest tensions here is, obviously Burnham has this impulse to increase council house building nationally, but there's what central government wants to do, and then what all the individual councils then want to do are not necessarily going to be the same. And if Burnham is serious about increasing devolution and allowing places to, be held accountable for the choices that they're making, it may be the case that some councils choose to have very different tenure mixes or price points to what Burnham might regard as the ideal.
Yeah, and also, I mean, there's going to be housing challenges all over the country, and the housing challenges will be slightly different in different parts of the country. But there are certain parts of the country where the size of the challenge is significant, and the nature of the challenge is quite significant, not least because it straddles, whether you think about it from a accessibility labour market perspective, or temporary accommodation, or homelessness issue. Those things are not evenly distributed across the country, both in terms of the presence of the issue, but also the scale of the issue. So you're also hoping, you would assume, a geographically variable kind of response, right?
And I mean, the other problem with that is then some of the public land on which it will be easiest to build on is not necessarily anywhere near where these issues are, right? Former RAF airfields out in the middle of nowhere, very easy to build council housing on those compared to, Zone 2 London or kind of inner city Manchester.
Yeah. I mean, we've done a bits of research looking at this sort of, why would you have a rationale in today's economy for building social housing? The first indicator might be the length of your waiting lists, which serve as a kind of proxy for demand for subsidized housing, and they vary massively across the country. And there's a clear urban, less urban picture there, although it varies. But then otherwise, private rents in urban areas tend to be slightly higher than the surrounding rural areas. So if you are thinking about building cities which are for everybody and mixed, then you would prioritize cities as places where you would build subsidized housing. That is complicated because then you're saying let's deprioritize other areas which still have a waiting list. But in our view, London should be receiving a significantly larger share than it is. London has received only a 50% uplift compared to the last decade, whereas everywhere else has seen more of an increase, whereas London alone has over half of the people living on temporary accommodation. And if you were being really sort of hard-nosed about it, you would go, where is the biggest problem? I'm going to give them half the money. And if that isn't politically acceptable, then I think you go, well, we've got to increase the size of the overall pot.
Okay, let's take a step back, or put it in a broader context, because this, we talked obviously about what the new Prime Minister has said in this space, particularly around council. But we started with, the housing crisis more generally. And even if we get substantive increases in the council stuff, there's still an awful lot of other housing that is being built through the market system as currently. And also, if we want even if we want to get the gains in the way that have been expressed, there's a bunch of other things we probably need to think about substantively. So, and again, zoom back out, put this in a bigger picture. The housing crisis is 4.3 when we did it. That was a couple of years ago. It's probably bigger than that now because supply side has nowhere near kind of responded to the nature of it. So it's a bigger problem than it was even then, and it was big then. And we're going to need to figure out a system-wide approach to how we deal with that. So put it in that broader context of how we move forward on the housing problem, and particularly the urban housing problem in the round.
Yeah, for sure. So the government's ambition is to build 1.5 million houses over the course of this parliament. As the parliament has unfolded, I think ministers have become more and more, I don't know,
What is it? It's challenging.
challenging.
It's bold.
Bold. Yeah, there's the adjectives continue to evolve as we proceed. I think it's certainly wider public debate. I think there's very little expectation, if any, that 1.5 million can be met under the current regime. Certainly, it seems where the government has been quite active on the planning reform agenda, rewriting the NPPF, introducing strategic planning for the kind of metro mayor, shire mayor tier that is evolving. It's essentially trying to get the current system to work, current planning system to work a little bit better than it does currently, particularly focusing on these kind of greenfield sites where we know at various points in history the 1947 planning system has worked okay at facilitating such kinds of urban expansion onto these greenfield sites. The mirror image of that is that the government really seems to be struggling in urban areas in particular, not least, London, where they increased the capital's target substantially. And house building is now at a very low level. So the gap between the government's target of about 85,000 a year, we're now running at about 12,000 a year, according to Molior stats released earlier this week. So figuring out how we increase house building in urban areas in particular is important for the government's national house building agenda. Our argument would be that we do need pretty big planning reform to the system itself, moving away from the discretionary case-by-case system that seems to particularly struggle in urban densification, urban development, replacing that with a more flexible zoning system like that what we see in France or Japan or New Zealand, which were in places we know are much better at building urban house building than we are. I think some of the conversation, I think Burnham has sort of given a bit of a nod to this. You sometimes see people say, "Oh well, planning reform's not a silver bullet, therefore it's not worth doing. Like we should do something else instead."
It's more complicated.
It's more complicated than that. It's actually very complicated. Like unlike every other aspect of human life. Sometimes those people will say, "Oh, but council house building, that's the solution. That is actually a silver bullet." I think our position is that actually we need lots of silver bullets if we're going to stop this particular werewolf. And we should be doing kind of big scale planning reform, making it easier to build. That will help both the market, which we absolutely need to increase to solve our economic challenges in particular, but also make it easier to build social housing as well, and make it easier to sort of tackle some of the social problems which clearly motivate a lot of concern.
Yeah, and in the spirit of silver bullets, I mean, Maurice, you've also, that's for another day, but we've also done quite a bit of work looking at, for example, the contribution that new towns may or may not make to the overall housing agenda. Again, making a similar point is that you definitely want them, you definitely want as many as you can get, and you definitely want to max out on every one of them, but they are a part of the solution, not the solution, and you can't rely on any one thing. I wasn't going to ask you about that. I was going to just pick up on what one of the things that Anne was saying, because again, I think as we move, or as we are now in a new administration, new Labour government led obviously by Andy Burnham, I think it's also important just to emphasise that the Starmer government introduced quite a few reforms, albeit maybe not as big and as expansive and ambitious, whatever, that we were encouraging them to do, but a bunch of reforms that are positive. And the issue there is continuity, pace, but get it done. Don't suddenly now stop and think we need to go back to the drawing board. Actually, some of this stuff really needs to be nailed and hammered through the system.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of stuff on planning reform which would be relatively easy for Burnham to pick up, complete, and see through. And certainly the debate definitely doesn't need to sort of what the existing Labour government has done very well is sort of say planning reform is a really
Yeah.
important part of the answer, and they've done things on greenbelt, which I think we're not in a political space where that is at any risk of being rolled back, but making sure that local authorities are operationalizing that through their local plans is going to be a really important part of Burnham's agenda, picking up where they've left off. And then there are a series of other things which are kind of in play, consultations which have come to an end, but a decision hasn't quite been made yet. Planning committees, I think, has gotten over the line. There's open on whether or not biodiversity net gain should be removed from urban sites and quite how that will be defined. These things can be wrapped up, and that would be a positive change for the cost of house building. Other things like allowing more developers on medium-sized sites to give their affordable housing contributions in cash rather than providing free homes, which they have to find some registered provider to buy off them, otherwise the development stalls. Things like that, which are small bits. No one would ever claim that these are silver bullets, but if you see the current crisis as being lots and lots of things which are not straws that break camel's back, then undoing these and introducing lots of positive small changes is something the Labour government has been doing okay and needs to.
Yeah, I think that's probably the overriding message in some respects, that right, which is there is no one solution, silver or otherwise, but there's also what we want to avoid is lurches from one thing, prioritization to another thing, and sadly, but the harder challenge is to make progress on several things, but you have to keep going on the things that you made underway in addition to whatever else you want to do. That's where we're going to hopefully get the numbers up to where they we need them to be, not just in the next few years, but actually for a sustained 10, 20, even 30-year period.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think one area of good fortune is I think on quite a few of these different areas, it dovetails quite nicely with Burnham's impulse to improve accountability and increase council control over lots of these different areas. I mean, take for example, kind of medium sites exempting, kind of housing association, kind of affordable thresholds for those sorts of often quite marginal sites. We saw quite a big backlash from a number of housing associations saying that this would be a complete disaster for affordable housing supply. What's actually being proposed is let's give more resource to councils so that they can decide whatever affordable housing they want to provide, given the development they're allowing of this particular size category. So to the extent that we can find a way to package reform in this area, and whether it's improving incentives, improving resource, or improving decision making at the local level so that more stuff gets built, hopefully we can continue to push the new government in being a progressive force in this area.
And so to finish where we started, as you say, for the moment at least, the only guide we've got to the policy program is the speech that was made a couple of weeks ago, and we've talked about the encouraging signals that were in that speech, whether it's devolution as the centrality, the organizing framework, whether it's a recognition of innovation and competition and tradable firms that are exporting their activities, whether it's transport, the need to have integrated transport across different big cities beyond London, and also recognition that housing, broadly defined, but also just as having a good place to live, but also as a function and as a role in the economy, was in that speech. And I think that's the most positive signal we can take. I mean, that's what we've got at the minute, and encouraging the new administration to develop that out, but also to carry on with much of what we've seen over the last few years is probably a good place to finish. So thank you very much to Maurice and to Ant. You can get all of our work on housing. There is loads of it on the website, centreofcities.org. Until the next time, take care and stay safe. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to this episode of City Talks, brought to you by the Centre for Cities. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Podbean by searching Centre for Cities. Please rate and subscribe if you liked what you heard. You You can follow the Centre on Twitter at Centre for Cities, all one word, or on LinkedIn for the latest on what the Centre is up to. To hear about all our latest reports and briefings and upcoming events, sign up to our fortnightly newsletter via our website, centreforcities.org. If you have any comments on the episode or suggestions for topics we should cover, we'd love to hear from you. Do tweet us or send us an email to info@centreforcities.org.